There's lots of chatter this week and last week about de-dollarization as more and more nations around the world pull out of the dollar system. So let's break down what exactly that means and what can we expect to sort of see changes in our own lives moving forward. Hey, Molly here. Welcome to the show. Today we're going to talk about de-dollarization. It's kind of a long word, but it's been very popular and making the rounds in the last few weeks as we see more nations, like those in the BRICS alliance, start to conduct trade outside of the dollar system. And it's kind of being used by the media to create a lot of fear and anxiety that, the dollar's going to fall and all of our money will be worthless and this terrible, terrible stuff. So let's talk about what it actually means, and I'll share sort of my view as to moving forward. Well, I actually think it's going to be a great thing for all of us once we get through kind of a messy transition. So, all right, the first thing is that the dollar, the current fiat US dollar, has been used to fund a very, very expensive military for the United States. So the idea that was made in the agreement with the petrodollar agreement in the 1970s with Nixon was that the U.S. would provide military support to the Middle East, specifically led by Saudi Arabia and the OPEC nations, if they agreed to only sell oil to other countries in dollars. So because it created this constant demand for dollars, it kind of created this ability to be printing dollars. The value of these dollars was always very, very strong and going up. And that was used to subsidize the military. Then the military was used for a couple of things. I think my understanding is initially it was sort of an agreement to just protect the supply chain to make sure that pirates around the world weren't going around and attacking these oil tankers, stealing oil. So it kind of kept the peace. And also, my understanding was to protect the broader supply chain, which enabled this era of globalism where we buy things from around the world and they're shipped via shipping container. And it's very rare that you hear about a shipping container being like hijacked or stolen or whatnot. So the US military, part of that role was to ensure that the global trade ecosystem was protected. And that's a good thing, right? However, over time, things can be abused, and the US military has been used as a tool for a specific group of people who don't really act in our best interests to pursue a specific political agenda. And if any nation around the world tried to exit this dollar system, there were often very serious consequences. Two notable names that come up on the list for this topic are number one, Muammar Gaddafi, former leader of Libya, who tried to create a gold backed African currency to enable the African nations to trade in a currency that they felt was sound money and that was in their interest and enabled them to not have to participate in the dollar system. Well, we as Americans were fed a whole lot of stuff about Gaddafi. I don't know if he was a good guy and only did good things, but it does look very suspicious that all those things weren't a big deal until he tried to pull a large group of nations, the African countries, outside of the dollar system. And he was demonized, labeled this sort of bad guy, enemy, dictator, whatever, and then eventually was taken out. The second guy on this list was Saddam Hussein. So, again, not saying he's a good dude, but I don't think any of these world leaders are generally good people for the most part. However, he had a similar thing in that he wanted to trade oil outside the dollar system, actually using the euro, is my understanding. And we know how well that ended up ending for Saddam Hussein. And sadly, here's the really sad thing is like the Iraqi people were absolutely devastated, murdered, and traumatized by the reaction of the US military and the people who are commanding that. One thing that's helpful for me to helpful to understand that I've kind of look at these things through a different lens, and I talked about this in my last video about some of the deception, is that I was kind of raised to look at the United States as this country, and we were sort of all Americans together, and we had this amazing military that was part of our values and protected, those values and those interests, and they were all good and patriotic and blah, blah, blah. Well, if you look at the United States, not as a country, but as a corporation that is a subsidiary of the City of London Corporation, kind of changes the viewpoint of this, and that the dollar is a product of the Federal Reserve, which again is a subsidiary of the City of London. So these are sort of European colonial interests that have taken many countries around the world and exploited them for their resources. You see this happen with energy producing countries in the Middle East. You've certainly seen this happen with Africa, a lot of minerals and other types of diamonds and resources, gold. You see this with even the United States with being a producer of things. So a lot of these countries around the world that are rebelling right now are former or our current producers of products who are former colonies of essentially this City of London banking cartel. And the U.S. military was used by this entity to protect their interests, not necessarily our interests. And those interests were to ensure that this one currency was used and that anybody who kind of strayed from the political agenda was put in check. Great book. If you're not familiar with this, I actually lent it to somebody, so I can't show it to you, is Confessions of an Economic Hitman by John Perkins. He really explains how this government entity, sort of three-letter agencies and IMF and other things like that, are used to destabilize countries that don't toe the line. And he has many examples of even like Central American leaders who were really good people doing great things for their citizens were taken out because they did not support a specific agenda that either came from the sort of banking cartel or corporation specific interests. So it's kind of a dark story, but it does explain the big picture about what I think is going on right now. And so, what will likely happen as we see this movement away from dependence on the dollar from all these countries is that the role of the US military will decline. And I actually personally think that's a great thing because we have a lot of these young soldiers go off to these other countries to create wars that are very profitable, and the soldiers die. And it's unnecessary, very sad. And the interests that we're told are protecting, I'm not really clear that those are my interests or people like me's interests. I think they are the interest of a particular small group of people who find war to be very profitable. They even have some other darker benefits that they like to realize from war. There's also a lot of money, this is gross, a lot of money in rebuilding after war. Many, many loans are given out, and the banks that issue those loans and make interest payment, get interest money off of it, find rebuilding post-war to be very lucrative. We even just saw that recently with, the loans for post-Ukraine are already being issued, showing that it's going to have been a very profitable operation for some of these financial institutions. So that's the first thing that I think will happen with de-dollarization is that the budget for the U.S. military will go down, which means we won't need as many big equipment, tanks, drones, planes that are often used for things that aren't good for anyone. Like bombing people is not a good thing to do. It may be bizarrely necessary sometimes, but I think of the vast majority of the instances which these things have been used are not really as they are portrayed. So I think if we stop killing people, that would be great, and the military will be smaller in scope as a result of de-dollarization. All right, number two, I think we're going to see an amazing resurgence of U.S. manufacturing. I think it's going to be rough because as a society, as an American, I think we've been brainwashed that certain types of industries are considered like more admirable or more respectable. Often these are sort of service industries that involve sitting in front of a computer all day, making PowerPoints and Excel things that I did for decades. And those are considered like more respectable professions, where some of the professions around manufacturing are not given that same level of respect. So it'll be, I think, a transition for all of us to have to recalibrate how we view some of these things, knowing that I created thousands of PowerPoints over decades that no one cares about ultimately, where if I use those resources to potentially produce products of value like food, clothing, some more essentials, I'm not regretting my former career. I just think that I was kind of brainwashed a little bit to think that those types of careers were considered better than others that actually produce more useful items. So the last couple of decades, because of the strong dollar, it has been very difficult for manufacturers in the United States to compete. I had this soap business for a while. I've talked about this here. And I ended up kind of coaching other bath and body product businesses. And what we learned was that it was really difficult to buy all of the components and the ingredients in the United States, simply because the cost of things like bottles and jars and the packaging is so inexpensive from China, and there were so few suppliers in the United States who had like a much smaller variety and were so much more expensive. Like, you couldn't really make the math work. So the very few businesses I kind of talked to who really tried to be full American product, American made in terms of all the components and ingredients, was really, really hard. And if you wanted to scale and have a business that employed people and was actually profitable, it was almost impossible to do that. And that is due in part to the fact that the dollar is very strong and the currencies in these other nations was very weak. So if we see that shift, it could be competitive for you to create a business that created supplies or ingredients for some of the other manufacturing industries. Whereas right now, it just would be really difficult to do that successfully. I passionately think that food production should become more localized. If you buy fruits and vegetables that were produced halfway around the world, they're often going to be shipped when they're not even ripe, and the nutritional value of those things are going to be much, much lower. So I kind of hope we see this shift away from globalization, especially around food, so that we can get away from processed, preservative-laden junk food and eat more sort of natural things that are actually better for all of us in the long run. And I think de-dollarization is actually the gateway to a healthier food supply chain that isn't so globalized. So places like Trader Joe's, sorry, they're bastions of globalism. I think their packaging is cool and it's a neat experience to go in there. But if you look at where all of this stuff comes, very, very little of it. I don't go to Trader Joe's that much anymore because there's one in my town, but they're not about local. Like, a lot of the things are from all parts of the country, of the world. And there's nothing wrong with those products necessarily being made in other places. However, you add this necessity of a long shelf life for all of those products that are shipped from everywhere. And food is naturally produced to break down. And if you're buying food that doesn't break down, that's kind of a flag that it's not going to necessarily break down inside of you either and release those nutrients. Anyway, okay. Number 3, the crypto world loves this idea of decentralization. And I think if you just even looked at the fact that we've had this sort of one reserve currency for the last 50 years, that is the bastion of centralization. And forget about crypto and distributed ledger technology and blockchain for a second, and just imagine a world where we don't just have one currency, where you have a bunch of currencies. Like, there's lots of options. The idea of a reserve currency is really about store of value, that if I'm a country and I have a lot of profit or wealth or extra money or whatever you want to call it to store, I've got to store it in something. I could store it in gold, I could store it in diamonds, or I could just keep my life easy and just store it in the currency that I'm conducting most of my global trade in. And it just so happened for the last couple of decades that has been the dollar, but it doesn't have to be that way. There's no reason why we can't have 10 reserve currencies. As long as they're all used and stable, there's no reason why you couldn't store wealth in your own national sovereign currency if your country is doing well and things are going well. And that would actually create a decentralized system where now you have choice, you have some competition, hopefully in a constructive way, and you have less influence from the one entity that has the power to print the reserve currency, which has been the dollar / the Fed for the last, especially since 1944 after the Bretton Woods Agreement. The idea that all the countries of the world have to work to make money except the United States via the Bank City of London could print money at will. It's just not fair that all the other countries have to kind of produce something to be able to participate in global trade, and then there's just one country that doesn't have to do that and kind of acts like a bully at times. So, and again, I don't think this is us, me as Americans who were doing this. It was this corporate structure who reported into kind of a European oligarchy who was dictating these terms. So as we see decentralization, there won't be one cop on the playground. Now the question comes is, well, who's going to protect the supply chain? Who's going to protect all these oil freighters? Well, we're going to have to figure that out. I think that not, different countries could kind of chip in and participate if that's necessary. But if we see a movement away from this insane global supply chain where all the products are moved around the world towards one that is a little bit more regional or locally centric, we won't need the supply chain to be as protected as much. I have suspicions around who really are the entities that are potentially going to mess with the supply chain, and whether there's ways to mitigate that risk. Sometimes if you want to sell insurance policies, you might maybe create some artificial threats so that there is a need for the insurance policy, and that the insurance policies for the global supply chain, that is a big business for Lloyd's of London. They make a lot of money protecting all these entities. Anyway, I'm not making any accusations, just throwing that out there. All right, and the number 4, there's also, I think, this misperception that kind of, I fell for this for a while too, is that if the dollar as we know it goes away, this fiat dollar that's printed indiscriminately with and used by the US government with no regard for ever kind of balancing a budget. If that went away, this idea that the dollar and the American money falls, that's not necessarily the case. We could very likely just get a new currency, one that is backed by assets, one that trades on par or at parity with other currencies of the world. Like there could be a 1-to-1 with the euro, a 1-to-1 with the pound, even a 1-to-1 with the yen, 1-to-1 with the peso. And so all these currencies, for all intents and purposes, kind of are the same in that the trade is 1-to-1, but you can go through an exchange like ODL to sort of literally swap from one currency to the other. And if they're all kind of equal, first of all, the Forex thing goes away. If you're a Forex trader, just be prepared. Although this is kind of my thesis here. I don't know that this is necessarily a fact. But if that sort of goes away and you don't really have this battle of currency strength, then trade is just a little bit more chill. And you can store your wealth in whatever currency you like. There's lots of competition, so there isn't this one group who has all this power around the money creation. And with the US dollar, it's now on par, and if it's asset backed, sort of known as the US Treasury note, there's no reason why that can't be a great thing for us to use and for us to store value in. One of the biggest problems with the dollar in the last couple of decades is inflation, in that what you could buy with a dollar in 1975 is very, very different than what you can buy with a dollar in 2023. And the price of gold has gone up. So which sort of says that the dollar has gone down because it's priced in dollars. But if we move to a system where assets back the money, and you can't just indiscriminately produce new assets like you could indiscriminately print new Federal Reserve reserves, then the dollar becomes a better store of value. And everyone in the American money system now has a better system that, people who issue a lot of debt, or people who take out a lot of debt, actually, they like inflation because their debt becomes worth less over time. So if we also move away from this system that is so built around debt with mortgages and car loans and student loans and credit cards, we're sort of pushed into this debt system at a very young age and kind of expected to live within this debt construct. If you get kind of hooked in this debt world, inflation's not a terrible thing, but it actually is for savers. So some responsible practices, that what's called high time preference, when you sort of have a very optimistic view of the future, you want to be saving for the future because you want to have great opportunities and be able to do things down the road. And so the inflation system really made people think very short term, get into this debt trap, and not really there was no incentive really to be a saver of cash because you knew over time it was going to become worth less and less. So if we move away from the current fiat system that has created all sorts of crazy price inflation with things like homes, for example, and we move back to a more sound money asset-backed world, I think it's going to be great for all of us. And it will be more decentralized. We'll see less people being killed because, imagine if no country had a military anymore. Just like hypothetically say that, right? Just for argument. How would we have war? Like, we wouldn't. You could go yell at somebody and you could go like have a meeting and talk about things. But if you didn't have the opportunity to be bombing each other, I'm just kind of curious if out of necessity we would be forced to resolve conflicts and disagreements in other ways. In the same way that if I have a problem with my neighbor, I'm not going to drop a bomb on his house. We're going to go and hopefully talk about it like reasonable people and find a solution where everyone kind of gets what they want. I think we've kind of lost some diplomacy in this world because we have the opportunity to just bomb people. And let's sort of say, maybe we move away from that as society and look for more higher energy, like more societally advanced ways to resolve disagreements and work together. So personally, Even though I think it's going to be weird to go through this process of de-dollarization, we're going to see some consequences. Personally, I think long term, I'm pretty optimistic that it's actually going to be a great thing for all of us, certainly for other countries. And even as Americans, we're going to have a better money system that is more fair and beneficial to all of us. Now, things like if you hold a lot of current fiat US Treasury bonds, like there might be some shock there, but we'll see how that plays out. And just know that the whole money thing is kind of made up anyway. And especially this fiat money thing, it's a construct that we sort of just have an agreement that these things are worth a certain amount of money. And so when we start over with the new system, we will just make new agreements and have new ways. And the best investment you can always make is to invest in yourself and learn how to be good at things, get some skills so that on the new side, let's just say the worst thing happened and you lost all your money. If you're good at stuff, people will pay you to do things for them, and then you can start over and make new money and live life, enjoy it. So, all right, that's my take on de-dollarization. If you like the video, please hit the like, subscribe to the channel if you haven't, and I will see you in the next one.